Explain a little bit about what you were doing, what the mechanic is that we're seeing a little bit, and then we'll get back to the technology in a little bit. We can talk about it, but just so people.
So this is what we're calling kind of a perspective switching kind of interactivity, and the idea is essentially as the story plays itself out in real time, the audience can transition between three different character perspectives, and you're not actually impacting what happens. It's not a choose your own adventure story in that sense. It's much more about trying to understand more of a holistic context for this space and this community. So we're really using this kind of multi-perspective storytelling to dig into a place where there's a lot of different people living different lives at the same time.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Now, I'd love to talk a little bit before we dig into the story itself, a little bit about you guys, filmmakers, writers, app developers. But how did you guys come to work together?
That is a great story.
And an hour later.
An hour later, yeah. It
right.
easily could be that
right?
long. But I'm going to try it in about 30 seconds.
Sure.
Ben and I met in college.
Right.
We were, I think the easiest way to say it would be the ones that were the most eager. We just wanted to make things. And we were lucky to find each other. And I think that we also sort of grew up that way. Both Ben and I grew up just making things and constantly being creative, and that feels sort of essential to our core. And so when we're in a new environment, I think that we both seek other people that feel the same way. So I would like to think that the moment was in slow motion and there was a freeze frame. There wasn't, but it was pretty close.
Right.
Where it was like, hey, we should be friends. Like, you're way too excited about this, and I'm way too excited about this. This could be a thing, right? This could be a thing.
And it was.
And it is. That's the best part.
And it was.
And that was 8 years ago.
I was going to say this. So that was 8 years ago, and so you guys have worked on a number of projects together.
Yeah, we have Holy Night, obviously. Holy Night is not our first interactive film. Our first interactive film is a film called Otis, which we took sort of a very different approach. It's similar in that it involves multiple perspectives being switched at real time. The difference, though, is that it was just much smaller scale. We didn't really know what we were doing at the time, to put it in the nicest way, or rather, it was an experiment. We were like, we had this idea about creating content that didn't necessarily fit into the box that film and television had sort of laid out, and we were like, I don't really know if this is going to work. Like, I have no clue. And so we pulled our resources together and said, let's make a thing.
And I mean, it's fascinating because you talk to a lot of interactive creators, storytellers. That's really where a lot of it comes from. Like, let's try something a little bit different, and we don't know if it's going to work or not. And failure is a good teacher too. Like, that's a big part of it. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Holy Night itself, and kind of the development process of the story. I know that there was a lot of research that went into kind of finding this particular thing. So how did you guys start this kind of process? Where did it come from? Setting aside the technology maybe. Right.
So Casey and I have been kind of doing research on small American towns for a while now, and we kind of wanted to take it a step deeper than we had before because we've done a lot of reading articles and books and stuff like that. But then I spent some time down in West Virginia, and it was just an interesting experience of kind of taking the same way that Casey and I really love collaborating and bringing people into the room with us, which in a sense is kind of what this interactivity is for us. It's really about bringing the audience into the room to have a conversation with us and not for us to kind of share our story. But in that same sense, the research that we wanted to do in order to really do the best job we could representing this community was just having me go and shut up. And like, it was not my job to go and like try to have an agenda or to try to get something that I wanted out of it. It was just to be silent and listen and see what I saw,
So you spent time with the folks there. You like really just were embedded.
Yeah, and like one like small story that I think does a good job of showing what that experience was like was I got in, I woke up the first morning, I walked out my front door and I was like, this is another world. It was just like really rural in a way that I'd never seen before. Like not like a small country town. It was like mountains and trees, and like people were like growing out of the mountain. It was crazy. And then it was this experience. My mom's a professional storyteller, and I've always felt like libraries were a home to me. So I kind of like went to the library, and I've all these wonderful memories growing up of kind of the library being this warm space, and they looked at me with like icy daggers in their eyes. They were like, "What are you doing here?" I was like, "I'm sorry." I like asked them if there was anyone I should talk to, and they like totally shut me out. And I was like, "This is weird, but like whatever." And then I kind of walked around the town for a bit and got pulled into the church, and the pastor there sat me down, and like they were having a meal for folks who couldn't afford meals, and it was so warm and so open, and I was like, this is not what I was expecting. And that experience continued to happen over and over again in different ways. And then this film is our attempt to kind of distill a lot of that experience into, again, not like a very clearly, like we don't have a clear agenda with it. We're not trying to say a specific message. We really want to try to show some of the differences and nuances and complexities in that world.
And how long were you embedded? Like, so you're embedded there, took some time, and then when did that story actually start to emerge? When did this narrative start to come together?
Like a week later.
A week later. Okay, got it.
Because we kind of went in with an expectation that we really wanted to make an interactive short.
Sure.
And we had really great opportunity to work with Chris Janney, who I hope is here. Hi.
Hey, Chris.
But that was kind of our larger idea going into my kind of research down in West Virginia. And I came back, and then Casey and I just spent like night after night after night in front of a whiteboard, just like erasing stuff and connecting dots and being like, okay, this is happening here and this is happening here. Like, okay, in order to represent this part of this community, this character has to be this thing. It was like this crazy 4-dimensional jigsaw puzzle.
Remember that eager thing?
Right.
Yeah.
You guys touch upon, a really very serious issue in this, the opioid crisis. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and how that informed your storytelling, what you saw on the ground, but what you were trying to represent in the piece?
Sure. So for me, at least, it, again, is really not trying to have, like, it's a short, it doesn't have the room to dig into a lot of the nuances around how this happened and what's happening still. And we have a larger series that we're working on that speaks to some of those questions in a more robust way. But with this piece specifically, I think that what our biggest goal was essentially to show a community that it's not simple enough to just say it's a community in crisis, because there's still a lot of strength and interconnectivity that exists in this place. And I think it was really our mission with this piece to show how, yes, there are a lot of challenges around the way that the Rust Belt has kind of dealt with the fallout of, OxyContin and the wave of heroin that followed it, along with kind of the job loss. But again, that there's this like deeper human interconnectivity that is the foundation that has always existed in this place. And like, it's certainly not our jobs as outsiders to be like, look at how this place is totally different, because in a lot of ways it's not. And then in some ways it is.
Well, and it's interesting too that you mentioned like, oh, you don't have a lot of room in a short to kind of look for nuance, but I think the way that you guys have constructed this narrative, actually there's quite a lot of nuance there, especially because you're asking the ask of the audience is to switch between those points of view. So you do pack an incredible amount of subtext into each of these shots, so I suppose maybe that's a good kind of transition to talk about how it was shot and how it was put together. Maybe, I mean, we've talked a little bit about your 4-dimensional jigsaw puzzle, which it feels like that's, I don't know if I've talked to an interactive or immersive storyteller that does not eventually have to like rewrite everything we've ever learned about narrative in order to do it. So do you want to talk, both of you talk about that?
Well,
a little bit
if there's one person between the two of us who knows about style, it's Casey. It's not me.
I think just to your earlier point about sort of creating it and making sure that there's subtlety with everything, the thing that we walked away from our experiences in both in West Virginia, but also sort of at large in communities that are suffering, for lack of a better term, is that there are people in this equation. And I think it's very easy to forget that there are families and there are people, and there are people that look like me, there's people that look like Ben, there's people that look like everybody in this room. And it's easy to place a lens on them and say, you're different than me, therefore I'm going to isolate you. And that, to us as creators, felt completely wrong. These are people. And we really wanted to show that human side without it being this sort of on display voyeuristic look at what can go wrong in the world. Like, that feels to us like that's just the wrong way to approach a story. And maybe that's because we're by nature pretty friendly people, and we're just sort of, that's how we don't see the bad in people typically, which might be to our detriment at times. But
well, and we do acknowledge that there are differences, and I think that you did, like, you put in a lot of work to make these three perspectives feel different.
Right, and I think so the biggest thing with that is that we said each film is its own film. By no means should they ever be, should they share much of anything. So we sort of said, it was very beautiful because we were able to effectively shoot each perspective in one day. So with the exception of the pharmacy scenes, we shot all the pharmacy scenes at the same time. But each perspective, we would wake up every day and be like, okay, if yesterday was David Fincher, today is going to be Steven Spielberg, right? And like, just as a cue, and it was like, okay, how do I process my brain around this? Like, that's just like a weird, when you're in such a dark, heady space, our pastor character, without giving anything away, has a darker tone. Whereas the kids who are on the snowmobile have a much lighter tone. And so, like, juxtaposing that is sort of interesting in my brain in a hotel room in Syracuse, being like, how do I do this? Like, I gotta, like, transition somehow. So I'm like, yeah, that was an interesting, like, own debacle in my brain. But we really tried to make sure that everything felt different. So everything was shot completely differently. It had its own style guide for every single perspective. We even went so far as to say that all of the instruments are different. There's no instruments that overlap. All of the edits are at completely different times. There's actually no competing colors, too. Like, the only time that we couldn't change that is, like, snow, because there's snow everywhere. But, like, their costumes are intentionally different. Like, we really, really tried to make sure that it felt as distinct as possible. The color grades, everything is different.
How big was that style guide you made? Like 70 pages or
89
something?
pages.
89 pages of a style guide.
Yeah, it's a style guide. It's really, really
You guys
long.
are crazy.
Yeah, it's really long.
No, I say that with all love, absolutely, because no, that's absolutely required though. Whenever you're digging into something, and that's actually the point, right? Like you made that a choice, and so you have to chase that. You have to do that all the way, because if you don't, then people are going to see through it. So, all right, from a filmmaking perspective, then. You've got three different styles, you've got an 89-page style guide. Let's assume that it's 33 pages or, something like that, a piece. From an editorial perspective, when you're cutting together the individual pieces, how do you keep yourself from flirting with things outside of, okay, so this is the snowmobile, kids, whatever else, flirting with the pastor? How do you keep those, or do you let that in a little bit? I don't know.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So part of the only way that the edit can actually work is if you are acutely aware of everything else you're doing in all of your other sequences.
So you have to be like literally omnipresent.
Correct.
Yeah, right.
You literally have to be omnipresent.
Again, crazy.
Yeah. Or just really detail oriented, right? So there's a lot of notes somewhere in an ether of my apartment that's like, hey, this happens at this time. This happens at this time. And so you have to sort of hit these time markers at a certain point, because a good example of it is there's a scene, the pastor's scene, there's one particular scene where we screwed up. We shot it's supposed to be a one-take shot, and it's just way too long. And it doesn't actually work in the scheme of everything else. And so we had to get really creative and say, okay, how can we manipulate this in a way that it works? And if you guys go out and check it out, you can hopefully not see it. But we got really
literally
creative.
what everyone's going to go out and find.
Right, they're like, where's this shot?
Yeah.
So I tried very hard to keep it as an individual world, where when we were editing the pastor's scenes, his name is William, we were editing William's scenes, we would really only be in that scene for a week, 2 weeks, whatever it was, and then we'd transition. As we started getting closer to the final product, it became this very strange party in my brain of like all these people and all this music, and it was strange. But there were other times where like the composers are an interesting thing. We worked with a duo, and I had each of them score individual perspectives, and then they also together scored one perspective. So they were intentionally, and they're a partner. They're partners. That's what they do. And I was like, I would prefer you didn't do it for this situation, which I think sort of threw them off. But in the end, ended up really working. So it's an odd way of working because we're effectively making 3 short films at the same time with the same crew in 20-degree weather.
And then at the end of it all, you're inviting, I guess what you'd call, I mean, it takes a village, right, to make a film. But then ultimately, when you put it together in the box that you put it into, you're then asking the audience to then mix them all up, to participate a little bit. So can you talk a little bit about why interactive? Why did you want to make an interactive film, as opposed to 33-minute, epic or 3 shorter pieces? Like,
who should do it? What do you think?
Take turns?
I'll take it. Let's do it.
Cool. I'll do kind of my 2 points quickly.
Sure.
One is, I think we really wanted to show the idea that over the course of a single day, there are all these people who have very different simultaneous lives. Sure. And the format where you really only focus on one at a time, I think is stronger for us than like a more mosaic approach we've seen done in the past. So we really wanted to get that across. And then also the way that this community could be represented for us was, again, it's not our place to say like, we understand this, audience, listen to our understanding of this thing. It's much more, here's what we experienced. We want you, audience, to come into the room with us, explore our understanding of this in your own way, and again, have that kind of like collaboration and partnership between us as creators and the audience in a way that typical, more passive content doesn't.
And I think, to sort of echo Ben's point, I think it's ingrained in our nature. We are, I think, unique in Hollywood is kind of the only way to describe it, in that like we're a package deal. Like we share a lot of the same responsibilities. Ben handles a lot of the writing. I predominantly handle most of the directing, but it's a very open dialogue. Everything we've ever created together has happened from this place of conversation and this place of collaboration. And I think that A, is indicative of the way that both of us grew up. We both grew up in very happy homes and around people, constantly collaborating and making things, and that's sort of part of our core. And also, we're millennials. We're 21st century filmmakers. Like I grew up with a phone. I grew up with a video game system. Ben grew up with a video game system. Like, to us, it just felt natural that you touch the screen. Like that's so ingrained in what we do. Like it's almost weird to me when I sit in a movie theater now. I'm like, I can't. This is weird. Why is it going on so long? But also, like, I'm in this chair and it's strange. So it's like I think that's part of our core. But also, there is, in this particular situation and this particular project, there isn't an answer. A lot of people, when you talk about an issue that's as complex as opioids, as poverty, as being forgotten in America, there's no answer. Many people just want to look for an answer. Hey, here's the solution. That is not the way that it works. There's so many answers, and there's so many voices in the room. And so we felt that we weren't doing justice to the community if we just said, hey, here's our solution. Here's our version of it. Here's our take. It's much bigger than that, because it's about a town. Yeah. It's not about one person. It's about a town. And towns are much more complicated than that.
Well, and I mean, then by creating, again, I keep calling the whole thing like the box that you put it in, you actually do, in a very artistic, very real way, give everyone the option to kind of dig into it and understand that there's a million different ways to watch this, probably in an infinite amount of ways to watch this, and an infinite amount of ways to process this, just as there are probably an infinite amount of ways to kind of think about the problems and the issues that you present in the piece. I'm backtracking a little bit here, but were all of your actors, were they local to this town, or did you find them, or did you bring people with you? We brought people with us. Okay, and there are some people that are local. Right. Depending, we didn't get to the scene with the one who's probably the most amazing local, but we brought everybody with us from New York. Oh, that's great. They do an excellent job. So
Maybe some of them
And they're here.
oh, and I'm embarrassing
Anybody?
people.
Hi,
Oh, boy.
Monica.
Hello
Hi,
there.
Monica.
Excellent
Hi, Brenda.
all over. Great. So there are, I mean, to kind of dig into the, again, I don't know, this is maybe the wrong way to put it, but the ones and zeros for a second, the technology driving the experience, right? Well, I've got two questions here. I'll start with, there are a number of I don't know, I'd call it prefab solutions. You mentioned one with like tiles, and you kind of select, oh, I want to go here now, which I think all of us are kind of familiar with generally because of things like YouTube or whatever else. But why did you guys decide to effectively break it and create your own system?
Didn't exist.
It didn't exist. Okay, that's the right. Yeah, okay.
We started this whole journey. So Ben and I have been collaborating for 8 years now, which feels crazy in a great way, but time flies. Love you, buddy.
It's gonna be okay.
And yeah, right. It's feel okay. And when we first made Otis, as an example, we were the only thing even remotely like it. I mean, most people stared at us like we had 3 heads. Like, you want to do this? Why do you want these characters? Why do I have to watch it on a computer? And we were like, yeah, we're not sure we have a good answer yet. And as time went on, we got a much better answer. So as time evolved and we started understanding our process better, and we started understanding this crazy thing that we were making, we started developing an app. So right now, where we're screening it here is off an iPad over there, which is a huge step for us, because all of a sudden it's much more intuitive, it's much simpler, and it just didn't exist. Like, there was nothing out there that could facilitate anything like it. And so we built it effectively.
Well, and again, applause to that, because, or kudos, I guess, to that, because what you've done is you've created something that allows you to maintain the cinematic sort of experience. You get these big, beautiful, colorful, just well-crafted images that aren't kind of destroyed because you've got a picture-in-picture thing and you're being like bothered. Aside from the one prompt in the beginning that's like, this is how you do this, because you have to give someone, we always talk about it, I put it in the context of invitation to play. Like, if it is interactive, you have to say like, all right, well, this is how you do this thing. Otherwise, people get lost. But I mean, you've kept it, so that people can revel in the film a little bit and get lost. And I know that in speaking to some of our staff and our team here, we certainly have people who, as they go out to the iPads that we have set up in the lobby, they fully are aware that they could flip around, but they actually sit there and watch all 3 pieces.
And that's totally okay.
That's fine. That's one way to do
okay.
it.
And that's one of the things that I think is really the most essential to Ben and I, is that we don't believe that content should ever tell you if you're doing something right or if you're doing something wrong. Mm-hmm. A lot of the film industry and a lot of the game industry has a barrier up that says you need to do a certain thing. Rats in a maze, right. And says you need to do a certain thing a certain way. And I think that that's just, excuse me, it's bullshit. I just think that doesn't make sense. And I think that doesn't work. And so we really tried to make something that was as intuitive as possible. You can swipe on a phone. That's a thing that's ingrained in society at this point.
It's everyone does it every day.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
What took longer to develop, the film or the app?
The film.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm just making sure.
Well, because it was pretty funny, actually. We worked with an app developer to
Right.
put the build together, and it was his name's Andreas. He's very big. He's very Swedish, and
He's like 6'6". He's huge.
but he heard us like kind of like trying. We wanted to like get the pitch perfect. We're like, okay, so then you can like switch from one to another, and then it doesn't load. It like continues, and it's the timeline. He's like,
It's seamless.
yeah, and he's like, oh yeah, I do that in like 2 days. And we're like, cool.
You mean like this? It's this, he's already done.
He wasn't kidding. It was amazing. It was something that we had been like trying to truncate through and like ram together in like so many different apps and so many different ways. And he was like, I got you. And 24 hours later, he's like, here you go.
See that?
Wow.
He said, wow, this is done.
Amazing.
Let's finish the movie. No, because that in itself is special because, and again, I've talked to a lot of folks that play with different sorts of interactivity in cinema, right? And it seems like a lot of folks get caught up on the ones and zeros of making the magic happen, the man behind the curtain stuff. And then the story perhaps gets lost because that becomes the focus. So, I mean, we've talked about this, I think, individually, maybe probably half a dozen times now. It's seems to be where all of our conversations go to. But I think I know where you guys come on it, but I'd love for you to talk a little bit about technology that serves story or story that serves technology. And I think with you guys, you've shown very much that story is first. Story is first. But if you want to, any thoughts, anyone,
Sure. All you, big dog.
So I think that, my background's a bit more in game design, and there's a lot of ideas in the ways that games are made about how the mechanics of the experience are the experience. And that's a lot of the reason that like games have quote unquote bad stories, because it doesn't actually matter like why you're killing the dragon. It matters like what makes the ones and zeros and like the speed of it and whatever else. Like that's the experience. And Casey and my background, even though we've dabbled in games, is primarily in film. And the parts of film that we love really are the like conflict, the characters, the character interactions with each other. Like we really wanted to dig into the parts that just made stories great, and have always made stories great. And for us, the kind of simplicity of these mechanics of either, in this instance, it's, switching between perspectives, but even like you're describing, the kind of more branching, bead design, choice-based interactivity, the kind of like maze, essentially. If you can take that and justify it with the story so that the mechanics and the thing that you're doing is reflective of the story you're trying to tell, that's the like best case scenario. So for instance, like we're working on new interactive projects now that are more choice based, and one very high level thought that we had pretty early on is, okay, if you're going to be making choices, what's like a really high stakes, emotionally intense experience where you're consistently making choices? Parenting, and like if you can dig into what it means to like be a family member who's trying to like nurture a human being, and like that can reflect the way that the choices are presented to you and what kinds of choices you're making, suddenly the story itself gets catapulted to the front in a way that it wouldn't if it was just a passive experience. So that's sort of what our approach has been for the most part with the kind of story technology interaction.
And I think the other side of story first too is our first real stab at this was this short we made called Otis. And we started it because I read this article in the New York Times. Correction, I read it on Twitter. And then I was like, this is a New York Times article.
In your bed.
In my bed.
21st century filmmaker.
Total 21st century filmmaker. Remember that part? And I sent to Ben, and I was like, hey, you should read this article. It's this crazy story about this boxer who lived in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan and was a victim of his society. Like, that's the only way to describe it. And I cried at the end of it. I sent it to Ben, and I was like, there's something here. This is so interesting. And I think like a year and a half or so, we wrote it as a feature. We we were much younger then, we weren't as experienced. Wrote it as a feature, and we basically looked at each other and said, it sucks. Like it sucked. It wasn't good. And the biggest problem was that it was inherently biased. And because it was us trying to tell this person's story, and his story is much more complicated than we can ever even attempt to tell it, because his story is about a town, not about him. And that's what makes the story so interesting. And so we realized, we were like, this is the story we have to tell. If we want to tell it in any way, it needs to be in this style. So a lot of our stuff comes as story first, and then trying to find a piece of technology that fits that, often with failure. That there isn't a piece of technology that does that, or there isn't an existing thing. We have to make it ourselves, which is also potentially to our detriment. But we realized that for us, we always joke that at Ben's core, Ben is a storyteller, and at my core, I'm an artist. And that collaboration with each other usually ends up in these kind of gray areas where if you look at this, is it a movie? Maybe. Is it a video game? Maybe. And each day it's different. It depends who you're talking to, really, right? And that's what's interesting for us. We were at a convention 3 years ago, and
with Otis.
With Otis, not with this film. And
world premiere,
world premiere
status.
And we were there, and this guy walked over to us. He was like really aggressive and like runs over. He's got his backpack on. He's so excited. And he looks at our screen, and we had like all, it was a bunch of people with all, it was an indie game developer conference, and there were all these games set up, and most of them were different than ours.
Platformers.
Platform-based games, right. And this guy walks over, and he goes, "How do I beat the game?" And we were like, you don't.
It's a story. You experience it, and then he's like,
"See ya," and left. And we both looked at each other and were like, that was amazing. That was the best thing that could have happened to us, because that's not our audience. And we're totally fine with that. There's no point in trying to go after that person, because there are games and there are stories, quote unquote, that work for that person. And we're not trying to make that. We're trying to use technology to help tell a story, because it's in our pocket, and it, in our opinion, only makes a story better.
Well, that's actually a fantastic story, because that was one of the things I wanted to ask you guys. As you're showing it to friends, family, colleagues, mentors, I was curious if anyone tried to beat Holy Night, to treat it like a game. You know what I mean? Be like, oh, and I'm going to get the right ending where everyone's happy, or whatever it might be. I mean, has anyone ever, have you just kind of given it to them with virgin eyes? And
well, so it is really interesting to see how people with different backgrounds interact with a technology like this, because one of the biggest things for me and Casey in our approach is to be accessible and to open the doors and welcome people in who don't consider themselves gamers and who don't think that that interactive storytelling is for them. And we want those people to come in the room. That said, there are differences between people who have a long history of playing video games and people who have no history of playing video games. So the easiest way to put it is, if you put this experience in front of someone who typically is used to movies, it'll start, and in the web base, it doesn't even have the finger swipey thing. It has an overlay that then disappears, and you can sit there, and then it starts, and then you watch the film all the way through, and then you finish it, and you're like, okay, and then you restart it, and then you switch perspectives, and then you watch it all the way through, and then it finishes, and then you switch perspectives, and you watch it all the way through, and then maybe if the person's feeling really adventurous, then they'll start it a fourth time, and they'll kind of slowly oh, I know this. Oh, this is so cool. And then they'll get into it that way. And then if you put in front of a hardcore video game person, it starts and they're switching constantly. And right. It's terrifying to see somebody do that next to somebody who's just a film person. And again, we love that. We love that both of those people can get something different from it.
Well, I mean, you wouldn't have designed it this way if you didn't want to see that kind of complete different range. So I would actually want to turn it over to the audience for a minute, see if there are any questions from you guys out there as we're going. Any questions for these guys?
Well, I'll give the annoying answer, which is, can it be both? I think the real core of this piece is, if you have individual character-driven stories that then are put in a collage with one another in real time, so that you're seeing these individual lives, and then you as an omniscient, kind of voyeuristic third perspective can look in and see these individual character-driven stories existing in the same place at the same time. That kind of gives you this kind of more sociological perspective of saying, oh, okay, wait, this is actually bigger than just one person. And at the same time, if you just sit down and watch it once through with one character, it would be a more psychological experience. So that's my fairly pretentious answer. I don't know if you have a less pretentious answer.
I wouldn't call that pretentious. It was just accurate. I see your point. And my argument is, yes, to Ben's point, it can be both. I think that we have the advantage of distinctly not being film, but also distinctly being film. And I think that a game can do that. And I think games have done that. And there's a number of examples of that in which it works. I think part of the issue, though, is that, and this is sort of the larger kind of future question of where we lie and whatnot, where do those two worlds combine? And when do those two worlds combine? We are both steadfast to the opinion that it is inevitable, mainly because of the audience and because of where people watch stuff, more than anything, right? I'm a filmmaker. I make commercials for a living. We write scripts together. I watch YouTube like no one's business. Does that make me a bad filmmaker? I don't know, but I watch it. I watch it on my phone. I watch things on my laptop, and I love it, to be honest. That's part of the experience to me. And I think that as time goes on, we're going to start to see more stories that do talk about towns and do talk about people. And the reason that it hasn't touched most audiences in a place like this, just as an example, is that most games are very inaccessible. They tell you that you have to get through these things and you have to learn these mechanics in order to access a thing. And in fact, they're prided on that, right? Like there's so many games out there that you can't actually play unless you know how to hit this sequence of buttons in this quickly. And to me, as a filmmaker, I hate it. Like it drives me nuts because I just want the story. Ben is much better at it, and I've watched him play a lot of video games, and I'm like, I have no idea how you're doing this, but it's impressive nonetheless. And so I think that there is a world in which we start to see a lot of those things combine as the barrier starts to lower a little bit, as things become more accessible, and as film continues to grow. I think that film it's sort of a beautiful time to be a creator, I guess, because a lot has been done, and there's more tools than ever. Like it's crazy how many tools are out there and how like what you can do right now. It's like truly blows my mind sometimes. And so I think that like it will change. And I think you can tell the story. That was a really long-winded way to say that. Hopefully it made sense.
How do you seek to observe the user? Like, yeah.
So we know of our ability to kind of do the creepy big data thing of like doing tons of capture on people's choices and then running analytics on them. And shout out to my best friend who would defend big data. But
we love you, Brian.
Yeah, calling out on big
but
data.
the way that we did it so far was much more janky because we're not quite that much of nerds. So we put out like a big anonymous survey and we sent it to like 50 people we knew, and we just like put a bunch of questions and asked for answers, and we did run our like dinky data on that. And one of our favorite stats
is that it's completely even. And that's what blew our mind, was that we just put a question that said, who's your favorite character? Just that simple. And literally, I'm not making the statistic up. 33% said one person, 33% said another person, and 33% said another person, which was crazy. Like we can use that to help us though. And that's the interesting thing that obviously Netflix has and every other streaming company has started to tap into, is that we have data on our side. And we have had people that have watched this in specific industries that have said, wow, you've got a lot of data here. Like there's a way to help this, age your storytelling. I don't think we found a solution to it yet. I don't think we figured out a way to say, hey, how can we use this data to help us tell a story? Right now it sits there, and you're totally right. We should be paying more attention to it, so thanks. Absolutely not. It's, in fact, pretty much essential to us. We love that fact. We love that you intentionally miss things. You could argue from a stylistic perspective, that's also the case in a place like this. There's so much information, you're not going to get all of it. So it's your job to figure out how you want to put it together on your own. There's just too much. We're also okay with it because you should be able to draw your own conclusions based on what you saw. Because everybody's going to experience life differently. And I think that's the sort of funny thing about Ben and I, is that because collaboration is so key to what we do, everything is a conversation. So if everything's a conversation, inherently we start to learn the differences between each other. And then, in a way, our stories become crafted around difference. And how there isn't, we don't want to say, hey, sit down and let us tell you this story, right? Like, it distinctly didn't want to craft that. Really, more than anything, because of the world that it's in. There isn't an answer to it. And we wanted to expose that as much as possible. But you can definitely say more to this if you want to. Just kidding.
You did great.
Great, cool.
So again, I think that the idea of choice is really interesting here because, again, at our core, we're just really friendly people. We love talking to each other. We love collaborating with each other. And for us, again, when we made more passive content in the past, it was this experience of saying, okay, I want to tell you something. I'm going to tell you a story. And my mom is a professional storyteller, so like she tells stories in a way that we don't. But like for us, it became an interesting new frontier when our approach was less let's tell you a story and more let's welcome you in the room and have a conversation. And whether it's this kind of like perspective switching or branching narrative like the maze or whatever else it is, the kind of core of our approach is really about, like you're describing, giving choice to the audience and then letting them speak to us as creators through this piece with their choices. So that for us kind of like takes what historically has been this like really powerful medium of telling people things, and it becomes this kind of new emerging medium of having a conversation.
I mean, not for nothing, we always joke about it, that for the first time in 10,000 years of storytelling, you have the ability to say, hey, what if that just didn't happen? And how does that change a story? And games figured this out a while ago. And the film industry hasn't, because it can't, right? Like it physically can't. The boxes that exist, quite literally the box that exists and the box that exists as an audience doesn't allow it. So yeah, it's an interesting future for sure, but choice is essential to us. I think that, yeah, choice is essential to us. Our future with it is twofold. The technology exists that we can go inside any major distributor and any major platform and create stories that look and feel just like the stories that you watch on any of the streaming platforms that you pay attention to, from YouTube to HBO to Netflix, in the exact same fashion. It exists. The tool is right there. So we believe that there is a future of us telling stories in all types of interactive formats. Ben had mentioned that we're developing a new script called Inherited. And Inherited is a choice-based system. So you do follow mainly one character. There's two characters, but it sort of ping-pongs between the two of them. And in that situation, we're giving viewers the opportunity to experience how something goes down, not what goes down. In this particular situation, we're saying, here's what you can watch. We never say what you can't watch. This is what you can watch. And so there is a future with that. We fundamentally believe that there's a future in this from at Hollywood at large. It just feels logical to us.
Yeah, and building on that, I think that it's been really exciting for us to kind of be the weird kids in the corner for so long, and
We're definitely weird kids in the corner.
and like making.
Hey, but right now we're in the center of the room. That's an upgrade.
We're in the corner.
All right, thanks.
But the idea being that like we really were working on this back before most of the film industry was even at all interested, and it's been exciting for us to have validation like Bandersnatch winning an Emmy, which is kind of just more evidence that there's a lot of potential in this medium. But at the same time, again, the kind of parts that excite us about interactive storytelling aren't about what can we do. It's also like what can other people do. Like it really is about how do we make case studies in this space that then allows others to break in and tell their stories using the same tech. Because at the end of the day, we're two people with two perspectives, and there's a lot of perspectives out there. Right. Well, I think that's kind of the point, which is when you're a player of a game, you enter into a contract with the developer from the first frame that says you're going to do a clear job of communicating to me based on a foundation of knowledge that we share. And as somebody who's played a lot of games, every time I start a new one, I have like a certain level of expectations about, okay, here's the starting place for us. Like this is, I'm talking to this developer and this team and saying, I know that you're going to take these approaches and I'm going to learn in these ways. And film doesn't have that. Like we're really in this new frontier of entering into a space where there is no contract that exists as a starting place. So for us, the idea of needing to offload the entire contract in like a short like this, where we say to an audience, oh, by the way, you're going to be making choices about whose perspective to watch. It's going to continue to play out in real time, and your choices are not going to impact what happens. It's only going to impact your experience of the events that are unchanged. That amount of information is so much to communicate because there is no starting place. There is no like established rhythm of we are kind of communicating in a space that exists already. So for us, I think that the way that we hope it comes through is because it is a relatively short experience, that if you go through it a couple of times, there's not so much complexity that you get lost in the kind of like weeds of the systems. After a couple of playthroughs, you kind of go, oh, okay, I get this. I'm not changing what happens. It's always the same. And therefore, it's in some ways, it's like learning through exploration of discovering these systems in a pretty condensed format. And, you know, hopefully there will be more pieces like this that can build on that foundation of knowledge in order to like build out that contract. So there's not quite as much legwork to do up front.
But we also, just to piggyback up Ben's thought, we also really wanted to make something that was accessible. Ben loves a game called Dark Souls. Shout out, Brian, where you at? And I hate Dark Souls. I hate it because I can't play it. Like, I just physically can't do it. My fingers can't move fast enough. I'm just not as attuned to a controller as Ben is. And to me, like, that's essential. And like that motivates the heck out of me personally, because I'm like, I want to make something that anybody can watch, right? From Ben to my parents to anybody. Like, they should also be able to watch it. Somebody who's never held a phone before. So we if anything is true about us, it's that we want to create things that are accessible to everybody. I don't believe that there should ever be a barrier in content. I don't like it when any content says I'm better than you, or you have to do this in order to access me. Like, that just feels wrong. That's not the way story works. That's not the way that humanity should work, I think, at least. That's a little highfalutin, but like, try and read through it if you can. That like, we wanted to create something that is accessible. And so limiting our choice was really important to us. And it continues to be arguably the largest motivating factor in everything that we create, is saying, how can we create this as simple as possible, that anybody can use it?
So this is the world premiere of Holy Night, being at the festival. How can all of these people talk about it with their friends? How can they get a hold of it? Is there a way for the people to get a hold of it? What's the release strategy for this?
It is going on the internet soon.
Okay. All right.
You cannot download our app, unfortunately.
Okay.
The Apple Store is evil and really hard to get on. Like, you literally have to like give your firstborn child to like get on the App Store correctly. So hopefully soon, but not in the future.
Our sponsor, Apple, thanks you.
Yeah,
No,
Apple's
just kidding.
real stoked.
Just kidding.
Yeah,
That's
thanks,
not
Tim
true.
Cook.
That's
Thank
not
you.
true. That's not true.
But right now you can go on it. It is there. You can Google it. Actually, it's down at the moment while it was premiering here. But after this festival, it's back up, and you guys can Google it.
Excellent. So I really want to thank you guys for trusting us, bringing it here, letting us play with it, letting us have it.
We should be thanking you.
And I really hope that everyone here will take a couple of minutes, actually take 11-ish minutes or so, give or take, and explore this piece that we have out here. We have 6 iPads that are playing it. It is here all weekend until I think about 5:30 on Sunday. We are, again, really proud to have it. It's a really exceptional bit of storytelling, and congratulations to you guys. Thank you all very much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.